Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So, starting our afternoon session, giving a bit more food for thought, and kind of each of us are going to be in our own space, whether or not we've got stuff we need to do this afternoon, or we're going to be sitting and walking. Um, we're going to take these ideas about the enlightenment factors, and then we get to have a personal experience of them. It's not, it's never anything different. Like the knowledge doesn't enlighten us, the knowledge doesn't set us free. It's the experience, seeing what that knowledge is pointing to. So I ask you, like, how did your morning go? And if you were practicing the whole morning, then you'd like, yeah, you say there was some good, there was some bad. Now, if you weren't practicing, like if I asked you, how did yesterday go? What comes to mind? And was it a good day or a bad day? And some might be like, well, I got in a car accident and I had to walk 3 miles to a gas station. Or somebody like, well, I watched my firstborn child being born. And somebody like, well, the president gave me a lifetime achievement award. But it's like whether it was good or bad or kind of mediocre, everybody would kind of say the same thing. It's like, yeah, it was a thing, but it's over now. And that's the quality of our normal worldly experiences. They're good or they're bad or they're so-so, but then they're over. And so even the most fantastic experience, we would say, a couple days later, a couple weeks later, a couple years later, it wouldn't mean that much because all of the joy that was associated with it was tempered by the fact it was impermanent. It's over now. And this is to say that's what normal experience is like. Everything that's outside of our spiritual practice, that's us engaging with the world. But now the enlightenment factors are talking about an internal experience, and they're talking about something that doesn't quite follow that same rule. So if we think back to a time when we were on retreat and we were really giving our all to practice, and we were inspired by the teacher, and we were surrounded by people who are also practicing, and just the whole world dropped away, and we just focused, and time didn't mean anything. We'd be like, years later, we'd be like, yeah, I was really doing something there. That was really something incredible. And it wouldn't be any different. Reflecting on it years later, we'd still say, no, those were the times in my life. That was something. And this is to point to the enlightenment factors are talking about something that is outside of the world of conditions. And so all the Buddhist practice is pointing towards the unconditioned state, nibbana. And this is where you don't say, yeah, it was a great thing, but then it ended. Well, because it never began. Because it never began, you can't say it ended. And that's the weird conundrum of nibbana, is everything that we know and we conceptualize, we see it start. And anything that starts will eventually end. It arises and it ceases, and it's impermanent in this way. But we don't say that about peace, because objects arise and cease, but the peace is there in between the objects. It doesn't have to be created, so it will never cease. And the enlightenment factors, when we go and we look them up, there's mindfulness, investigation of states, energy, joy, tranquility, samadhi, equanimity. When we look them up, we don't find paragraphs of text about what these things are, how they feel, what the experience of them is, when they arise, when they don't arise. Basically, in 5 large Nikayas, 5 large tomes documenting 45 years of the Buddha's teaching, is the most you'll say on the subject is energy is a factor of enlightenment. And he'll say the factors of enlightenment are really important. I mean, they're there in the Anapanasati Sutta, they're there in the Satipatthana Sutta, they're the factor, they're a wing of awakening. So they're one of the teachings that at the end of his life, the Buddha went all around India, wrapping up his teachings. And he said, the factors of enlightenment, remember these, pass these on to future generations. These are important. And yet he had never given a long discourse about them. And in retrospect, it's kind of because anything you could say about them kind of misses what they are. So we take energy, for example, energy as a factor of enlightenment. It's not a thing. I mean, it's not like we get to a state where we've got this spiritual, battery on our back, like the Energizer Bunny, and suddenly it gets topped off and we start just plowing through our defilements and letting go of all of our bad habits. When energy is high, we usually don't think about it. And this is a basic quality of the mind, is that when we have these factors, we're not worried about having them. We're not trying to guard them. We're not trying to protect them. We're actually just doing whatever we want. So when energy is high, we do whatever we want. It's when energy is low that we start talking about energy. So it's like if it's a day after a rainstorm and there's puddles on the road and the road is all muddy and we're kind of slogging through, we're like, this takes a lot of work, this takes a lot of effort. It's going to take forever. So slow, it's so muddy. I wish I hadn't gone this way. But the sun comes out and you don't really have to do anything. It's just the puddles dry up. And when you're walking on a sunny day, none of those thoughts come up. You don't even notice the road, really. You're noticing the trees, you're noticing the flowers, you're noticing the sky, you're noticing the sun. And our mind is the exact same way. When the factor of energy is there, it means that the mind has what it needs to do what it wants. It means that there is an absence of states of low energy. Just like the sun is there, all the puddles are dried up. When the puddles are there, you worry about the puddles, you walk around the puddles, you deal with the puddles. When the sun is out, there are no puddles, there's no obstructions. And it's like this with all the other factors. Tranquility, for instance. It's a curious thing because often we associate tranquility with samadhi, right? Like my mind will become peaceful when it's unified. Well, the Buddha is setting up this chain of events, and he's saying, well, actually, the mind becomes unified because it's peaceful. In order for the mind to be unified, it has to stop moving around. So once it stops moving around, once it settles, then it can start to become unified in samadhi. And so the factor of enlightenment that is tranquility is the absence of states of restlessness. This is how we can start to go back and kind of take an accounting of our practice, whatever it is we call our practice, and take an accounting in terms of the factors of enlightenment. When things are going well, are they going well because, we have bright lights, or we have waves of joy? Or are they going well because when we apply ourselves to something, we're able to do it? Part of the reason you would single out tranquility of mind as its own factor, where it seems like something just basic. It's like, okay, when the mind stops hopping around, that's not a thing. It's just the mind is not hopping around anymore. But actually, there is a sort of force to that. We like when the mind is stable, right? We appreciate when the mind is stable. We enjoy when the mind is calm and settled. And so to any degree that it can be noticed, just like, oh, my mind is not hopping around right now, then you could say the factor of tranquility is present in the mind. And it's not a different thing from the mind. And yet it can be said that it's there. And when we look at those times where we are having insight, if we look at the immediately preceding period of time, we would see that these factors of enlightenment were present to some degree. This is one of the interesting things. There's this debate in Theravada circles, in Theravada Buddhism, about, do you need samadhi? Do you need the experience of the jhanas in order to attain enlightenment? And it's this kind of weird conundrum, because the Buddha says that samadhi, sama samadhi, is a factor of the Eightfold Path, that the Eightfold Path has to be present for enlightenment. And he says this one-to-one causality. So if sama samadhi is jhana, and jhana therefore needs to be present for enlightenment, do you need to be able to be really good at concentrating your mind? And some teachers will say, well, no, because concentration doesn't have to be long-lived. It can be momentary. And even a single mind moment of samadhi, of concentration, is enough to fulfill all the factors. And for you to break through to some, break through your ignorance to some realization of a universal truth that's behind it. And it just takes a moment, really. We can look at what we really associate with insight. It's like we kind of know what insight is, even if we can't describe it. Yeah, there's like suddenly something about the world makes sense in a new way, that we see something that we've never seen before, and that's what we call insight. So these factors precede it, but how do we develop the factors then? And this is the thing, is like in all of these teachings, we don't get a step-by-step way of developing the enlightenment factors. Instead, the Buddha says they are to be developed. They are to be developed, and having been developed, it will allow the next one to be developed. So the enlightenment factors aren't the step-by-step path. They're not a thing that we do, because again, they're so simple, such basic parts of the mind that we only notice their opposites. Yeah, we're only associating with it. Oh, my practice is not going well. Yeah, I was all scattered. It's hard to be mindful. It's like there's no joy in the mind. Everything just feels blah. I say, yeah, but when the mind is getting energized, is getting interested, is getting tranquil, well, then we're just focused on our meditation object at that point. Yeah, and nothing is standing in our way. So to develop the factors of enlightenment, it's actually, this is where the Dhamma is this sort of wonderful kind of web of interconnected teachings. It's actually the Eightfold Path which develops the factors of enlightenment. It's reflecting on the Four Noble Truths, which develop the factors of enlightenment. It's everything that we do in our practice develops these factors of enlightenment. It's not a thing that we do to develop them, though we might reflect on them and recognize them and appreciate them, is they are getting stronger based on our whole practice lifestyle getting stronger. This is what a Daylong retreat, gets us a little glimpse of an opportunity to see. We get to reconnect with them. It's like when we've done a long retreat, we definitely felt it. The mind settles. Even if we're not trying to have the mind settle, it'll, to some degree, it'll settle if we're not doing a lot of stuff. And then we might have energy, and we might hear a good teaching, and we actually have the time to sit and think about it. And so that's the retreat, is just mimicking the lifestyle of an enlightened being. The lifestyle of an enlightened being at the time they get enlightened. Realistically, after they get enlightened, usually they're put in charge of a monastery and their life is not that peaceful anymore. But it's mimicking what it's like when these enlightenment factors are fully charged up. What charges them is a peaceful, a balanced, contemplative lifestyle. So we started the morning and we list off the enlightenment factors, and then we go out, maybe we're on the walking path, walking back and forth, and we're like, okay, I got to keep my mindfulness. And it's like, oh, but I got to keep my energy. And it's like, oh, got to investigate states. And where did the mindfulness go? Oh, yeah. And we find ourselves like trying to hold on to these things, right? And so we're trying to become like this 7-armed deity that has a finger on each of the enlightenment factors. And unfortunately, the enlightenment factors are, they're susceptible to the same rule as normal worldly experiences. They're going to change. We'll have some moments of high energy, where we don't have anything standing in our way, where we don't have any hindrance of laziness or torpor or sleepiness arising. But then those things will show up from time to time, and we'll have to deal with them. So as much as we try to hold on to the enlightenment factors, and we want them to be there all the time, that's just not possible. It's just not how the mind works. And this is something in any worldly experience that we have to make room for, is that there are times when we're applying the mind, but then there are times when the mind needs to be, it needs to have room. And I always liken this to the breath, because we can only breathe in so far. And then necessarily we have to breathe out. Our mind, our thinking mind, does the exact same process. We can apply it to something and we'd be like, no, today's about the enlightenment factors. Today's about the enlightenment factors. Today's about the enlightenment factors. The harder you try to hold on to that, the steeper the cliff when you can no longer hold on to it. It means all the time that you spend like, nope, bojanga, 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 you're going to have the equal and opposite reaction of time where you're just laid out on the floor and you're like, I can't do it anymore. I forget the alignment factors. It's just like, I'm going to turn on Netflix. Or so like you get through the whole day of deep meditative practice, and you get up from the cushion at 8 o'clock and you're like, great, wonderful, that was a day well spent. You go right to the freezer, you pull out the bucket of ice cream, and you're like, bah, 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 bah. And we've all had that experience. And I say, me too. Yeah. Because when we try to hold on, this is not what the Dhamma is encouraging us to do. And we can't always have these factors present. Even the enlightened beings understand that. The Buddha never would have had to tell his disciples, it's like, oh, when you're sick, reflect on the enlightenment factors. This will inspire you and bring your energy back up. You wouldn't have to do that if they always had an awareness of the enlightenment factors, if the enlightenment factors were always like just humming along and there was no states of low energy, states of not caring, states of, distraction. But because those things need to be given room to arise, they will show up. So also today, what we can look at is, how do we leave the room? How do we have the out breath and yet not have everything unravel on us? And this is where the Eightfold Path, becomes it's about a whole lifestyle. It's about the times when we're applying ourselves, but it's also about considering the times when we're not applying ourselves and how far from meditation and mindfulness and virtue and right view do we get before we swing back around. So the equation for cultivating those things which lead to insight, those things which lead to enlightenment, is not simply about how we apply ourselves, but also about the environment we set up so that these factors stay sort of strong even when we're not cultivating them. Do we set ourselves up for success? So I don't know how many times I've said factors of enlightenment since 8 a.m. this morning. Probably 15, 20 times. Just like the Buddha, I'll say it this way and say it that way and say it that way and say it that way. But then are you going to hear about this tomorrow? Are you going to hear about it a week from now? This is another question you can ask yourself today, is if these things feel so great, and if they are a quality of our practice when our practice is going really well, then what is it when we're not doing those things that make our practice really well? And is there a middle ground there? Does it have to be fully let go? Or like when we do walking meditation, right? So we sit here, we meditate, we try and stay with the breath, we try and stay with our experience, but then, okay, gotta get up, gotta stretch the legs. And we go out on the walking path, and probably our mind starts to open up a little, starts to relax a little, hears the birds, it feels the wind. And it's like, okay, now that is not the breath. That is not being hyper-focused on our meditation object. And yet, because we're not walking off the path, because we keep going back and forth, it feels kind of okay, right? If we stay on the walking path and we keep some mindfulness of what's going on in our mind, even if we're not hyper-focused like we are in sitting meditation, then we come back to sitting meditation, and it's not that hard to pick up where we left off. What we were doing is we were taking an out breath. We had been focusing the mind and saying, no, stay here, stay on this topic, stay on this topic. But then, then we go out and we just sort of like, okay, no, just open up the pores, just kind of let things in, but within boundaries, right? But we'll let things in, but we're not going to leave the walking path. We're not going to go do this. We're not going to turn on the TV. No, we're not going to eat the bucket of ice cream. We're going to be letting the mind go, but we're going to be on a track that still keeps us in a somewhat meditative framework. This is one of those skills that is not talked about as much, but it is half of, the spiritual practice. What we apply ourselves to is one half, but how we create the container that all of that isn't lost when we stop applying ourselves, that is the other half. And so how can you, and give it a try today, how can you, when you're not thinking about the enlightenment factors, still have your mind in that area, or have some touchstone to them, that when you sit back down, they're just right there again. Like, oh, this was just like that one time I was on long retreat and the whole world dropped away. You get up and you walk and you breathe. And it probably why, that one time when practice was so good was because when you took your breaks, you didn't have anywhere to go. You didn't have anything to do. So your mind strayed, but it didn't stray far. And so you were able to get it right back when you sat down again. So this is the second half of the day. It's a half of the day when energy is usually a bit lower. And this is not because, it's a physical thing. There's an actual circadian rhythm, and this is just a low point in the day. But that doesn't mean it has to be a time when everything's just going to scatter to the wind. Because there can just be that that seed of mindfulness that says, okay, let's see what my mind does when I'm not forcing it to apply to this one thing. And then, yeah, a bit of time later, we check in. Like, where did it go? What did it do? How much lack of mindfulness was there? How much lack of curiosity in the Dhamma was there? How much lack of energy was there? We can take note of that. That is useful information. And then we apply ourselves again. And we're like, okay, yeah, now, so let's develop mindfulness. And okay, the breath is getting interesting. And it's like, okay, yeah, I can feel the energy coming up. This is nice. We go through the enlightenment factors again. And then we get up, we breathe out. And when we breathe out, how far do we go? And if we can shorten the amount of time that we're lost, if we can get better at the breathing out, we're much further along actually in developing this balanced lifestyle. Because that's when things really go well. It's not just because of how we apply ourselves, but because the situations we've put ourselves in to succeed. Yeah. And that's probably the last thing that could be said is you can trust your mind. Even those times when it seems like we are daydreaming. This is an important function of insight. And this is part of why culturally, traditionally, insight is usually portrayed as an accident. A bucket tips over, or a candle flame goes out, or somebody catches sight of the full moon. And enlightenment, right? That's how it's portrayed. You don't hear any, you hear virtually no accounts of somebody being like, and I was sitting there and I was meditating and I was focusing on my breath and I was coming back to it repeatedly and then I got enlightened. You don't hear it that way. You hear they were really focused on their practice. They were really applying themselves. And then they got up and they did some walking. Or they went on alms rounds, or they opened the book and it opened to a particular chapter, and then they got enlightened. So charging the factors is not the whole story. It's also about what lifestyle do we find ourselves in once they're charged up, and we can look at that just as much. We work on that when we're not sitting on the cushion and trying to develop mindfulness and energy and all these things. Yeah. Okay. These are some thoughts. And why don't we take this, get up, do a little walking meditation or standing meditation or yoga or whatever pleases us. And then the rest of the afternoon session until 5 o'clock will be just this balance, sitting and walking. It doesn't have to be painful. Can be if you want. That can be insightful too. But just finding a rhythm that works for you. Okay.